This is The World This Weekend. Hello, I'm Stephanie Skandaris. Fear and desperation grow as Israel readies for its ground offensive in Gaza. Families of Israeli hostages held by Hamas in Gaza have met with Israel's prime minister, pleading for information.
We want her back. We want her back alive. We want her back healthy.
And inside Gaza, medical staff call Israel's warning to evacuate a death sentence for their patients.
What is happening to Gazans? It's a disaster. It's like the last day of the earth.
Also coming up, Afghanistan is hit by another major earthquake, its third in a week.
Those who have survived have lost everything. They are left with no shelter or food.
That's later, but first. 1 million people are now displaced in Gaza. There is almost nowhere left to go, with zero food or fuel entering the besieged territory. The United Nations today says thousands will die. Azam works with the UN Agency for Palestinian Refugees.
These are the sleepless nights, literally. Bombardment doesn't stop. The nightmare is always bigger and heavier during the dark.
With Gaza now well into the night, Israel is amassing its troops for an imminent ground invasion, retaliation for the Hamas attacks in Israel last weekend that killed 1,400 people there. Margaret Evans has the latest.
In Gaza, they can't bury the dead fast enough. Ice cream trucks that once offered sweet treats to children, now being used as cold storage for bodies, piling up. There is anger and disbelief written all over Yasser Ali's face as he watches workers trying to shift bodies wrapped in plastic outside the Shuhada Al-Aqsa hospital. This ferocious war goes beyond the right to self-defense, he says. The cemeteries are already full. Many in Gaza have taken Israel's 24-hour deadline to leave the north or face the consequences to heart, trying to move south, an impossible task even for some of the healthy. Walking through a children's ward in a northern hospital, Dr. Hussam Abu Safiya says to move the most vulnerable patients, babies in incubators, children on respirators, would be to hand them a death sentence. If you want to kill us, he says, kill us while we continue working here. We will not leave. With that 24-hour deadline already passed, the waiting for what comes next grows more unbearable. In Israel, too, people wait anxiously for the country's expected ground war to begin. None more so, perhaps, than the families of those taken hostage by Hamas gunmen during their bloody rampage last week. 126 people, it's believed. Air raid sirens sounding in the distance as journalists wait outside an army base in central Israel, watching the night sky as Israeli air defenses knock out a few missiles sent from Gaza. The Israeli Prime Minister Benjamin Netanyahu is inside, having called a last-minute meeting with a handful of the hostages' families. He came out to talk to journalists afterwards.
5 members of my loved family are kept hostage by the Hamas.
Ido Gordon says people want assurances.
The Prime Minister announced to us that one of the objectives of this war is to bring our loved ones back.
We want her back alive. We want her back healthy.
Mirav Gonen last heard from her 23-year-old daughter Romi on the phone, terrified and hiding from Hamas gunmen after she'd been shot at a dance party near Gaza.
That's the last time I heard her. And we just know that her cell phone is in Gaza.
Others have blamed Netanyahu for what they say is Israel's descent into chaos. Avichai Brotz, whose wife and children are missing, joined a protest against the current government. He doesn't want a war.
Just to stop the bloodshed. And I ask Hamas, which is holding my family, I hope, again, in good health, please stop. And the Israeli government to please stop and just bring the women and children back.
But as each long day casts its shadow, descent into even darker times feels almost inevitable. Margaret Evans, CBC News, Ramle, Israel.
concern is intensifying that the conflict may soon expand. The U.S. is now ramping up its military presence in the region, and it's trying to secure additional support for Israel. But as Katie Simpson reports, some leaders in the Middle East are publicly criticizing the Israeli response.
We are worried about the potential escalation and widening of this conflict.
The Americans say they're so worried, they've decided to send a second group of warships into the region. John Kirby, a senior member of the U.S. National Security Council, says the additional aircraft carrier will join the American cruisers and destroyers already in place in the eastern Mediterranean.
We don't want to see any actor, be it a state actor like Iran or another terrorist group like Hezbollah, widening this conflict, opening up additional fronts that will distract the Israeli Defense Forces from their primary fight against Hamas.
Iran is making fresh threats against both Israel and the U.S., warning of significant damages. The Iranian foreign minister saying today, quote, "If they do not cease their atrocities in Gaza, Iran cannot simply remain an observer." Urgent diplomatic efforts are underway to de-escalate tensions. French President Emmanuel Macron spoke by phone with Iranian President Ibrahim Raisi, saying everything possible must be done to avoid a regional flare-up.
We're working very much on that.
U.S. Secretary of State Antony Blinken delivered the same message to leaders from 7 Middle Eastern countries that he met with over the past 5 days.
What I've heard from virtually every partner was a determination, a shared view that we have to do everything possible to make sure this doesn't spread to other places.
Blinken also used the trip to relay the U.S. message of steadfast support for Israel and its right to self-defense, sparking public backlash in his meeting with Egyptian President Abdel Fattah el-Sisi, who criticized Israel's response as the pair sat in front of news cameras. This current crisis is a drastic one, Sisi said. I believe the ongoing retaliation goes beyond the right to self-defense for Israel and amounts to the collective punishment of the Gaza Strip. While the U.S. has not publicly called on Israel to show restraint, it says it expects the rule of law to be followed.
The way that Israel does this matters. Needs to do it in a way that affirms the shared values that we have for human life and human dignity, taking every possible precaution to avoid harming civilians.
Protecting civilians will be a key focus for a new senior American diplomat. The White House announced the appointment of David Satterfield, a special envoy for Middle East humanitarian issues. The creation of this dedicated post is yet another sign the Biden administration recognizes this crisis is set to worsen as the conflict intensifies. Katie Simpson, CBC News, Washington.
Sporadic fire across the Israel-Lebanon border over the past week is underscoring the threat of spillover into the region. Today, Hamas said it fired 20 rockets from Lebanon into Israel, while Iranian-backed Hezbollah also fired missiles. Israel said it struck back inside Lebanon in retaliation. Civilians were killed on both sides of the border, and the UN peacekeeping force said its headquarters in South Lebanon had been hit by a rocket. Freelance reporter Rebecca Collard is in Beirut, and I spoke to her earlier. Rebecca, let's start with the tensions along the Israel-Lebanon border. Where do things stand now?
What we've seen so far has been relatively restrained. It does not seem to me at this point that either Israel or Hezbollah wants a war on that border. Remember that they fought this deadly war in 2006, left more than 1,100 Lebanese people dead and more than 150 Israelis. And I think right now it's not an opportune time in many ways, especially for Israel to open that front. But I will also just caveat that by saying the feeling here when I talk to people is if Israel launches this ground invasion to Gaza, which we have been thinking is imminent now for several days, that is when we may see Hezbollah start something on the northern border. So once Israel is actually going into Gaza, then we could see things really, really escalate here.
And you spent some time in a Palestinian refugee camp today. What did people there tell you?
There's millions of Palestinians that live in the countries that border Israel, refugees that fled, for the most part, the fighting in 1948 with the creation of Israel. And in Lebanon, there's about 500,000. So today we were in the Shatila camp talking to Palestinians. And the first thing I'll say is that, you walk into the camp and, of course, everybody is either watching what's happening in Gaza on TV, or they're looking at their phones, looking at social media platforms, trying to find out what's happening. And then sometimes that's because they have relatives in Gaza, but I think also many people are just horrified watching the bombardment of other Palestinians. But I think the other reason that this is particularly difficult for Palestinians is because this order that the Israelis gave now for the evacuation of the north of the Gaza Strip, a million or so people, they're telling them to move south. In Gaza, most of the people that live in Gaza are already refugees from inside what is now Israel, or their children or their grandchildren. And that's the same in the Shatila camp. So almost everybody that lives there either fled what is now Israel in 1948, or they are the children of those people. And, I think sometimes it's hard for us to understand why anybody would hesitate from picking up their families and moving out of a place where there's conflict, especially if they've been warned that there is going to be a conflict. But, I think for Palestinians and people that I spoke to today mentioned this, it's that most people in the camp here and most Palestinians who are refugees now, and I'd actually say this about most refugees I've ever interviewed, whether they're from Syria or any conflict, really think that there is fighting, and that they will leave for a few days, or they will leave for a few weeks, and they'll be able to go back. And in the Palestinian case, of course, we're talking about 75 years later, and I'm talking to people, inside the Shatila camp who have still not been able to return. So I think that lesson for Palestinians is a very difficult one, and I think that they are watching what's happening in Gaza and have an understanding about why some people are hesitant to flee their homes.
Okay, Rebecca, thanks so much for getting those perspectives and for speaking with us.
You're welcome.
Freelance reporter Rebecca Collard in Beirut. A fifth Canadian has been confirmed dead in Israel. 3 others remain missing. That update came during a briefing from officials in Ottawa today. Their focus, trying to get Canadians out of both Israel and Palestinian territories. JP Tasker now with voices from both sides and the latest advice from the Canadian government.
I don't know what to do, honestly. We don't have any glimpse of hope.
With the war poised to intensify, Canadian Mo Nasser is trying desperately to get out of the Gaza Strip.
We're waiting for someone to tell us that it's okay to cross. Otherwise, we have nowhere to go. There's no escape.
There's only one way out of the besieged Palestinian territory, and that's through the Rafah border crossing with Egypt. It remains closed despite international efforts to ensure safe passage for foreign nationals. According to Global Affairs Canada, that includes 300 Canadians, permanent residents, and their families.
It's unthinkable what's going on here, and people don't know where to go, what to do.
Foreign Affairs Minister Melanie Joly is in the region to coordinate Canadian rescue efforts.
We're calling for a humanitarian corridor. There absolutely needs to be food, water, and fuel going into Gaza, because this is one of the worst places to be in the world right now.
Canadian officials say an evacuation could be chaotic. There may be only a small window to flee. Alexandre Levesque speaks for Global Affairs Canada.
Hamas is probably playing some obstruction inside of Gaza. It's very difficult to have a firm fix on what's going on inside. So it's not just a matter of opening the gates of a border.
Canada is among a host of countries that designates Hamas a terrorist group. With that, Ottawa is urging stranded travelers to be cautious at the Rafah crossing. Julie Sunday is leading Ottawa's consular response.
We are not telling people to go straight to that border until we have an understanding that there will be an opening. We are concerned about security issues at the border itself.
There's concern too in Israel. Canadian Jennifer Advocat was on her first trip abroad there when Hamas launched its brutal attack.
The air raid sirens went off and we had to go down to the shelter here.
She's one of 2,300 Canadians clamoring to get on board a military flight out of Israel.
There's been very little word at this time, so we're just hoping and praying and waiting for them to get back to us.
There's also fears the conflict could spill over into neighboring Lebanon. Global Affairs Canada has issued a new advisory warning against all travel to that country. Canadian Armed Forces personnel are also being deployed to Cyprus, ready to help if needed. JP Tasker, CBC News, Ottawa.
Police in a Chicago suburb have charged a 71-year-old man with a hate crime for fatally stabbing a 6-year-old boy and seriously injuring his mother. The suspect is believed to be their landlord. In a statement posted to social media, police said the victims were specifically targeted for being Muslim and because of the ongoing crisis between Israel and Hamas. Canadian auto workers have voted to ratify a new contract with General Motors. Labor union Unifor says more than 80% of the 4,300 GM workers it represents voted in favor of the deal. It includes hourly wage increases over the next 3 years and promises to convert hundreds of temporary part-time workers to full-time employment. Unifor reached a tentative deal with the company last week after a 12-hour strike at 3 Canadian GM factories. A University of Manitoba professor has come under fire for taking part in an event organized by a group placed on Canada's Russian sanctions list for spreading disinformation. The Valdai Discussion Club is a Moscow-based think tank and discussion forum established in 2004 by the Russian government, NGOs, and academics. President Vladimir Putin speaks at it every year. Radhika Desai made international headlines when she asked Putin for his opinion on a scandal involving a Nazi veteran who was honored in the House of Commons during a visit by Ukrainian President Volodymyr Zelensky in September. Karen Pauls has the latest.
I would say her actions are morally reprehensible.
Andreas Kazakamp teaches history at the University of Toronto's Munk School of Global Affairs and Public Policy. He's criticizing University of Manitoba political sciences professor Radhika Desai for accepting an all-expenses-paid trip to the Valdai Discussion Club earlier this month.
She gave the big gift of Putin being able to say that Canada has now provided further justification or proven the justification for our special military operation of denazifying Ukraine, which is pretty horrendous.
Valdai was placed on Canada's Russian sanctions list on September 20th for, quote, generating and disseminating disinformation and propaganda. Marcus Kolga is the founder of Disinfo Watch and a senior fellow at the Macdonald-Laurier and CDA Institutes.
It's basically a Putin-curated, Kremlin-curated propaganda fest.
During the conference, Desai made international news.
I have a question.
Asking Russian President Vladimir Putin for his opinion on Canadian MPs honoring a veteran who fought with the Nazi unit.
A Canadian hero. The Canadian Parliament has just made itself a laughingstock of the world by applauding a Ukrainian Nazi.
It gave Putin an opportunity to ridicule Canada and former House of Commons Speaker Anthony Rota. Now back home and teaching at the University of Manitoba, Desai says she understands the criticism but maintains she did nothing wrong and did not violate Canadian sanctions.
If I thought it was wrong of me to go, I would not go.
Sean Stevenson is a lawyer at Denton's Toronto office and co-leader of the Canadian Bar Association's Working Group on Sanctions. He says the sanctions are written mainly in a business context with the aim of halting financial transactions with Russian entities. And there is an exception.
You can accept a payment from a sanctioned party to the extent that there was a contract that was entered into before that party was sanctioned.
Stevenson says the repercussions of violating sanctions can involve criminal charges, prosecution, and punishments, including fines and potential jail time.
I think you want to take a long, hard look at who you're dealing with. It's becoming increasingly difficult to untangle these types of webs.
Desai says she and her husband were detained and questioned for nearly 3 hours when they returned to Canada.
Then they read to me from some statement, some printout they had of an interview I had given. They read to me my words, and they essentially implied that I should be ashamed of myself. And I said, I'm not ashamed of myself. I said those things.
Global Affairs Canada, the RCMP, and the Canadian Border Services Agency won't confirm if Desai and her husband are under investigation. Karen Pauls, CBC News, Winnipeg.
8 years of nationalist power in Poland may be coming to an end. Exit polls suggest the ruling Law and Justice Party took home most of the votes, but not enough of them to keep its majority in parliament. Opposition leaders say they'll move to form a governing coalition. As Megan Williams reports, they're pledging to turn the page on years of anti-migration policies and eroding civil rights.
Elation among Poland's pro-EU civic rights supporting opposition. The winner of today's national election in Poland is democracy, said Civic Coalition leader Donald Tusk. His thrilled declaration comes as exit polls showed that the right-wing Law and Justice Party would be removed from power. With only 37% of the vote, not enough to form a government, even with help of a smaller far-right party. For many Poles, this intensely fought election is the most important since 1989, when after decades of communist rule, democracy here was born. A feeling reflected in the record high 73% turnout today.
I'm fed up with the Polish war inside my country. We can be different, but we have to be one,
said this architect in Warsaw, among the more than half of Polish voters who exit polls show chose the opposition Civic Coalition or centrist parties that say they'll form a government together. This is my first time voting, and I want a better life for my mother and for myself, says this 20-year-old university student. In danger for the majority of voters were the freedom of press, abortion, LGBT and migrant rights, Poland's European identity, and judicial independence.
The democratic forces are the clear winner of Polish elections,
says political commentator Jacek Palaszyński. But a ruling party that flaunted the law and eroded institutions, he says, won't give up power easily.
This is a very dangerous time for Poland because it's obvious that after all these 8 years of theft, of violating Polish and European law, they will be charged with very serious charges. So they are playing for their freedom.
Ale przede wszystkim polskie zwycięstwo.
Tonight, Law and Justice Party leader Jarosław Kaczyński told supporters that while it's unclear whether the party will stay in power, that fighting days lie ahead. Observers say it could take as long as a month for Poland to have its next government. Megan Williams, CBC News, Rome.
People in Ecuador went to the polls once again today in a presidential runoff election. They're choosing between businessman Daniel Noboa and attorney Luisa Gonzalez, and recent polls show they're in a neck-and-neck race. Both candidates were escorted by heavy security as they went to cast their own ballots. It's been a campaign plagued by violence, culminating in the murder of anti-corruption candidate Fernando Villavicencio in August. The top issues for voters have centered around economic instability caused by the pandemic and a sharp rise in crime linked to the growing influence of drug cartels in the country. The winner will finish the current term of Guillermo Lasso, who called the election early to avoid an impeachment inquiry. Afghanistan is reeling from yet another earthquake. A 6.3 magnitude earthquake hit the western city of Herat. It comes just a week after a tremor of the same strength hit the same area, destroying villages and killing thousands of people. Philip Lee Shannock reports.
In Herat province, people were still digging through rubble looking for survivors from last week's earthquake when the latest hit. It's left little time for people to bury the dead. The United Nations says more than 2,000 people have been killed, more than 12,000 are without homes as winter approaches. Philippe Croft is with the World Food Programme in Afghanistan. He says after the first quake hit the region, a succession of tremors followed.
To a total of 7 earthquakes and multiple aftershocks over the past 8 days. Dozens of villages are affected, some entirely flattened. Those who have survived have lost everything. They are left with no shelter or food.
Anjali Rohn of Doctors Without Borders Canada says more than 100 injured are being treated outside hospitals.
Even after they receive care, they often have nowhere else to return home, and so they remain in the tents that MSF has set up outside the hospital, just waiting to know, where else to go.
Rohn says the immediate needs are medical supplies, food, and shelter. And she says it's challenging to bring attention to what's happening in Afghanistan with the ongoing war and humanitarian crisis in the Middle East.
The earthquakes in Afghanistan and the crisis in Israel and Gaza, these are very different and devastating crises in their own right, both of which warrant public attention and great concern.
Rohn says decades of war, the COVID pandemic, and the return to Taliban rule has left the health system fragile and struggling to cope with this latest disaster. Philip Lee Shannock, CBC News, Toronto.
Well, amidst that difficult news of destruction, there is a bright spot of joy for Afghanistan today. A tremendous victory over England at the ICC Cricket World Cup.
Bowled in! And it is over, and Afghanistan have the greatest victory in their history. This has been a remarkable evening here in Delhi. They have outplayed England.
It's already being called one of the greatest cricket upsets of all time. Afghanistan breaking its 8-year losing streak at the World Cup with this historic win against the defending champs by 69 runs. It hasn't been a particularly good tournament so far for England. First, there was an opening defeat from New Zealand. Now, with this loss, England's chances at progressing are hanging by a thread. You're listening to The World This Weekend on CBC Radio. I'm Stephanie Skandaris.
Happy smiles in Hong Kong for Leila Annie Fernandez, a champion again.
Canada's Leila Fernandez winning the Hong Kong Open there. The 21-year-old from Laval rallied from a set down to defeat Katerina Siniakova of the Czech Republic. It's the first win from Fernandez in 19 months and her third career WTA title. She had been ranked 60th, but will move back inside the top 50 with this win. Well, for decades, Mr. Dress-Up entertained Canadian children with nothing but simple crafts, songs, some costumes, and a sprinkling of imagination. A new documentary celebrates the life and work of Ernie Coombs. Eli Glasner opens up the tickle trunk and brings us this story.
Oh, would you like to have an airplane ride with me?
If you're Canadian and a certain age, you likely remember Mr. Dress-Up. And not just watching it, but the way it felt. The world slowed down, and it was just you and this guy in funny clothes and his friends.
There wasn't a time I don't remember watching Mr. Dress-Up. He was always there. Casey and Finnegan were always there. And they were always there when I needed them to be there.
Robert McCallum directed the new documentary, Mr. Dress-Up, The Magic of Make-Believe. Ernie Coombs died in 2001, but McCallum brought him back to our screens with some surprising revelations, including the Mr. Rogers, Mr. Dress-Up connection. Coombs met Fred Rogers working on his kids' show in the U.S. in 1961 when the CBC hired Rogers to create a Mr. Rogers prototype in Canada. There was only one man who shared his vision.
But of course these guys were, joined at the hip. It was a philosophy they shared. Fred Rogers chose Ernie very specifically to come to Canada.
Coombs' daughter, Kathy Lafort, says Rogers inspired Mr. Dress-Up's direct delivery.
Fred told him to look at the camera as a child. That's the child that you're speaking to.
Growing up in rural British Columbia, Jenny Lazan says Mr. Dress-Up felt like a father figure. Years later, she became a puppeteer playing Granny. Lazan says now, with the economy squeezing families, she misses his approach.
The lovely message with the Mr. Dress-Up show is, hey, you got some tape and a piece of paper, which, most people do have, that you can create whole worlds with something that is not really elaborate.
Ready for Pass the Parcel? Yeah!
Tune into a kids' show today, and you're more likely to see animation than arts and crafts. Director McCallum says there's a reason for that.
When you replace kids' content with primarily animated stuff because it's cheaper to make and easier to sell around the world and dub in other languages, you don't, A, get a sense of strong culture from any one country, but then you also have something that isn't grounded in anything real.
For Coombs' daughter, the documentary has been a reminder of the care her father took, even when the cameras were off.
I remember seeing him with the kids. They would sit on his lap and they would dictate a story and he would draw the pictures.
30 years and 4,000 episodes. Ernie Coombs never lost touch of his inner child.
I'm not self-conscious about putting on silly costumes and pretending to be a bunny hopping around because I know that kids like that and I like it too.
Eli Glasner, CBC News, Toronto.
Come and knock on our door.
Come and knock on our door.
We've been waiting for you.
We've been waiting for you.
You might recognize the Three's Company theme song, and you'll remember one of its stars, Suzanne Summers. She played a funny, ditzy character to perfection, but Suzanne Summers also had business savvy, launching a health and diet business empire featuring products like the Thigh Master. Suzanne Summers has died today, just one day before her 77th birthday. The news was confirmed by her publicist, who said she died peacefully at home, surrounded by family, and that she'd survived an aggressive form of breast cancer for more than 23 years. We'll leave you tonight with a little more from Suzanne Summers, showing off another of her talents.
You made me love you. I didn't want to do it. I didn't want to do it.
This is Summers singing the classic song You Made Me Love You at a 1985 telethon, decked out in a bright pink power suit, blonde hair flowing. This has been The World This Weekend. I'm Stephanie Skandaris. Thank you for being with us.
You made me sad, but there were times